Hello and welcome to Newsreel Asia's The India Report. I am Asad Ashraf. This week, I want to tell you three stories. At first glance, they don't seem connected. One is about a war in the Middle East, another is about oil prices and diplomacy, and the third one is about ethanol fuel and government policy. But if you stay with me, you will see that all three are really asking the same question. So let's begin with the story that cuts the deepest. 3 Indian workers had been killed by an American missile. That fact alone should have dominated India's public conversation for days. Instead, it arrived wrapped in the language of diplomacy. On 13th of June, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar spoke by phone with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to India's account of the conversation, Jaishankar launched a strong protest and stated that lethal action against commercial shipping could not be justified. It was a rare public rebuke directed at one of India's most important strategic partners. Then, Washington released its own account of the same call. The contrast was striking. India's statement focused on the deaths of its citizens. The American statement did not mention them at all. There was no expression of regret, no condolences, and no acknowledgement that 3 Indian nationals had lost their lives. Instead, the statement stressed that commercial vessels must comply with instructions issued by the US forces and that violations of the American blockade and the transport of Iranian oil would not be tolerated. Now read those two statements together, an uncomfortable picture begins to emerge. India appeared to be protesting the killing of its citizens, right? And the United States appeared to be explaining why those citizens had found themselves in danger in the first place. That contrast quickly became the center of the debate, yes, as the commentators focused on what Washington had said. Another question gradually came into view. What had India said? Or more specifically, what had India's Prime Minister said? The answer was nothing. Prime Minister Narendra Modi did not issue a statement. There was no public acknowledgement of the men who had died, no expression of sympathy for the families, and no direct comment on the incident itself. Now, silence in diplomacy is not unusual. Governments often choose their words carefully and sometimes choose not to speak at all. The more interesting question is why this particular silence seemed to trouble so many people. Part of the answer may lie in the expectations citizens carry about relationship between themselves and the state. More than a century ago, the German sociologist Max Weber argued that political authority rests on more than the ability to exercise power. Citizens accept the authority of governments because they believe that authority is being exercised in their name and for their protection. Weber was not writing about the missile strikes in the Gulf, but he was writing about the obligations that accompany political power. When citizens are harmed, people expect their government to respond in a way that recognizes the loss. They may not demand retaliation. They may not expect a military response. They may not expect even a diplomatic confrontation. What they do expect is to acknowledge. They expect somebody to speak on behalf of those who no longer can. That expectation helps explain why the silence felt significant. At the same time, Weber understood something else about political leadership. He called it the ethic of responsibility. Leaders, he argued, cannot govern purely through emotions or moral instinct. They must weigh consequences, they must consider competing priorities, they must make choices in an imperfect world where every decision carries costs. Seen through that lens, it is not difficult to imagine why New Delhi may have chosen caution.
Tragic loss of lives of Indian sailors recently, sir, in American strikes. Any words of condolences for the grieving families, sir?
Yeah, I do. I heard about that. It's a rough profession. There's no question about it. And we work together on it. This has been happening throughout time, but we work together on it. Yeah, certainly. We love all of those people.
The broader Indo-US relationship has become one of the defining pillars of Indian foreign policy. Defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, technology partnership, and strategic coordination in the Indo-Pacific all form part of a relationship that successive governments have spent years building. From that perspective, A confrontation over the deaths of 3 Indian workers may have appeared as a risk to interest extending far beyond a single incident. Well, that argument carries weight. Many people will find it persuasive too. In fact, Weber himself would have probably recognized the logic behind it. Yet, understanding a political calculation is not necessarily the same thing as accepting it. The discomfort surrounding this episode stems from a deeper question, not whether governments should think strategically. Of course they should. The question is whether strategic thinking fully explains the absence of public acknowledgement. What if the sailors killed in the strike had been Chinese? The comparison is less about China itself than about the expectation people attach to powerful states. Few observers would expect Beijing to treat such an incident as routine. Whether one admires China's political system or not, there is a widespread assumption that Chinese leaders would regard the death of Chinese citizens at the hands of a foreign military as a matter of national dignity and a visible response. Chilani's question therefore turns our attention back towards India. It asks whether India sees itself in similar terms, whether it feels equally free to speak forcefully when its citizens are harmed, regardless of who is responsible. That question becomes even more difficult to dismiss when viewed alongside India's own recent behavior. Only weeks earlier, when Iranian naval forces fired upon Indian-linked vessels, New Delhi responded quickly. The Iranian ambassador was summoned. The incident was publicly condemned. The government response was immediate and visible. This case was undeniably different. The country involved was not Iran but the United States of America, and the geopolitical stakes were considerably higher. It is precisely that difference that has drawn attention. Critics argue that India appeared willing to speak more forcefully when dealing with a regional adversary than when dealing with a strategic partner. Whether that criticism is fair is ultimately a matter of judgment. What is not a matter of judgment is what happened next. As the debate expanded, attention shifted towards the ships themselves. Officials emphasized that the vessels involved were not Indian flagged and were not officially Indian owned. Legally, those distinctions matter. International maritime law assigns significant importance to questions of ownership, registration, and jurisdiction. Yet the more attention was directed towards the nationality of the ships, the easier it became to overlook the nationality of the people aboard them. The men who died were Indian citizens. Aditya Sharma, Shivanand Chaurasia, Patnala Suresh. They were not policymakers. They were not geopolitical actors. They were workers who accepted employment where employment was available. Like millions of workers across the developing world, they operated within the system they did not control and probably did not fully understand as well. It is difficult to imagine that they possess detailed knowledge of sanctions, regimes, shipping networks, or the strategic calculations of governments. They went to work expecting to return home. They never did. And that is the point at which discussions about sovereignty, diplomacy, and strategy stop being abstract. Because every geopolitical event eventually reaches a family. In this case, it reached the home of Sushila Devi in Deoria. After learning that her husband had died, she sat on the floor of her home and tried to understand what happened. Through her grief, she said something painfully simple. If he had told us about the dangers, I would have called him back. That sentence lingers because it cuts through every strategic argument that has been made since. The G7 summit matters. The India-US relationship matters. Regional security matters. All of these considerations are real, yet they exist alongside another reality. 3 families lost people they loved, and the debate that followed was shaped as much by what was not said as by what was. This is where the political philosopher Michael Walzer offers a final lens through which to view this story. Walzer argued that governments perform an important moral function when they publicly name wrongs and explain why they matter. Political communities simply do not respond to events, they help society understand them. They establish a moral language through which citizens interpret what has happened and what values are being defended. That idea may help explain why this episode continues to resonate. The debate is no longer about a missile strike. in distant waters. It is also about recognition. A public statement would not have brought those men back. It would not have altered the strategic realities facing India. It would not have repaired the damage done to their families, but it would have signaled how the nation chose to understand their deaths. And perhaps that is what remains unsettled. 3 Indian workers died thousands of kilometers from home. Governments calculated consequences, diplomats exchanged protests, and analysts debated strategy, sovereignty, and national interest. Yet the question that survives all of those arguments is remarkably simple. When Indian citizens lose their lives at the hands of a foreign military, what does the country owe them? For many people watching this story unfold, the answer begins with recognition, and that may be why the silence became impossible to ignore. Let me now turn to something that may look like a foreign policy story, but it reaches every Indian home. A ceasefire was announced in the Gulf this week. At first glance, it looks like the sort of a story most people would skip past. Diplomats meeting in Switzerland, negotiations between Washington and Tehran, discussions about sanctions, military deployments, and nuclear disputes. The language of international politics can often feel very distant from everyday life. But this particular ceasefire deserves our attention because for the last 4 months, a conflict taking place thousands of kilometers away has been quietly reaching into Indian homes. It has been there every time a family paid for cooking gas, every time transport costs increased, every time food prices edged upwards, every time economists revised growth forecast and wondered how much pressure the Indian economy could absorb. Which is why the announcement made on the 14th of June matters. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif revealed that United States and Iran had finalized a memorandum of understanding and would formally sign the agreement a few days later in Switzerland. Shortly afterwards, Donald Trump announced that American naval blockade affecting ships leaving Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz would end immediately. The agreement includes a halt in hostilities in Lebanon, the removal of Iranian restrictions in the Strait of Hormuz, partial sanctions relief for Tehran, and a 60-day period during which both sides will attempt to resolve the nuclear dispute. Now, this is important. The nuclear dispute has not been resolved yet. That remains at the center of their confrontation. For diplomats, those details are important. For India, however, the real significance lies elsewhere. When Americans and Israeli airstrikes hit targets inside Iran earlier this year, much of the world's attention focused on the military consequences. The greater economic consequences emerged afterwards, when Iran turned its attention to the sea. Commercial vessels were warned away from the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic collapsed. Insurance costs surged. Freight rates increased dramatically. A narrow waterway between Iran and Oman suddenly became one of the most important locations in the global economy. That matters because nearly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Around 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas supplies through the same route. And India imports most of the energy it consumes. Nearly 88% of India's crude oil comes from overseas, and a large share of those imports normally travel through Hormuz. Once shipping through the strait became uncertain, India was never going to remain a distant observer of the crisis. The consequences were always going to arrive here. They appeared first in energy markets. Oil prices rose sharply as refiners competed for alternative supplies, and shipping costs increased. But the real story was never the price of the crude itself. The real story was what happened after the increase began working its way through the economy. Fuel became more expensive, transport became more expensive, food became more expensive to move. Businesses faced higher operating costs, inflation spread. Cooking gas became one of the clearest examples. India relies heavily on Gulf supplies for LPG, meaning that disruption in the region quickly translates into pressure on household energy costs. At the same time, higher energy prices increase costs across agriculture, manufacturing, and transport, creating effects that reached far beyond fuel stations and gas cylinders. This is the part of globalization that people rarely see. Wars are often described through military maps and political speeches, yet modern conflicts rarely stay where they begin. They travel through shipping routes, energy markets, and supply chains. By the time they reach ordinary people, they often bear little resemblance to the event that started them. A missile strike in one country becomes a higher fertilizer bill in another. A disruption to a shipping lane becomes a more expensive gas cylinder thousands of kilometers away. Philosopher Achille Mbembe wrote about the way systems power distribute the consequences of violence onto populations that had no role in creating it. He was writing about different circumstances, but the observation feels remarkably relevant here. Families paying more for cooking gas did not shape American policy towards Iran. Farmers facing higher costs did not influence the events in the Gulf. Truck drivers paying more for diesel were not participants in diplomatic negotiations between Washington and Tehran. Yet all of them carried part of the burden. The costs traveled outward until they reached the people who had neither caused the crisis nor benefited from it. That is why this ceasefire matters, not because it resolves every underlying dispute. It clearly does not. The nuclear issue remains unresolved. Iran's missile program remains untouched. In fact, military activity resumed almost immediately after the memorandum became public, reminding everyone just how fragile the situation remains. The ceasefire is real, but so are the tensions that threaten it, which means this moment should probably be viewed less as a solution and more as an opportunity. India has been given breathing room. The question now is whether that breathing room is used well, because the deeper lesson of the last 4 months is not that the Gulf is unstable. That has been true for decades. The deeper lesson is that India remains deeply exposed to instability through its dependence on imported energy, moving through a narrow maritime corridor that it does not control at all. Another crisis will come. It may not arrive next month or the next year, but it will certainly come. And when it does, the same waterway between Iran and Oman will once again influence the price Indians pay for fuel, fertilizer, and food. That is why this ceasefire deserves attention, not because it concludes a foreign policy story, but because it reminds how closely the daily lives of ordinary Indians remains tied to events unfolding far beyond countries' borders. And that brings us naturally to the final story of this week. If dependence on imported energy is part of the problem, then the obvious question becomes whether India can reduce that dependence. And that question takes us to a file signed in Nagpur that may prove far more significant than it first appeared. Let me end this week with a story that may appear technical on the surface, but could become one of the most significant economic decisions India makes in the coming decade. The ceasefire in the Gulf may bring temporary relief. Oil prices may stabilize. Shipping routes may reopen. The immediate crisis may slowly fade from the headlines. But crises have a way of leaving questions behind. And the question left behind with the Strait of Hormuz is a simple one. What happens the next time? Because the deeper lesson of the past 4 months was not that the Gulf is unstable. That has been true for decades. The deeper lesson was that India remains vulnerable to that instability in ways that affect ordinary citizens. A conflict taking place thousands of kilometers away was able to influence the price of fuel, fertilizer, and food inside Indian homes. Once you recognize that vulnerability, the next question becomes unavoidable. Can it be reduced? The question forms the backbone to an announcement made in Nagpur on the 13th of June. Speaking at the Sugar, Ethanol and Bioenergy India Conference, Union Minister Nitin Gadkari revealed that he had signed the file initiating the legal process for introducing rules governing the use of 100% ethanol fuel in Indian automobiles. At first glance, it sounds like a technical regulatory change. Seen through the lens of the Hormuz crisis, it looks like something much larger. It looks like an attempt to reduce India's dependence on imported oils. For decades, Indian economic growth has relied on energy sourced from elsewhere. Nearly 80% of that crude oil consumed in the country is imported. Every disruption in global energy markets eventually finds its way into the Indian economy. Sometimes the effect is barely noticeable. Sometimes, as we saw this year, it becomes impossible to ignore. The appeal of ethanol begins there. Unlike crude oil, ethanol can be produced at home. The crops are grown here, the processing happens here, the jobs are created here, the money circulates within the domestic economy instead of leaving it. That promise has helped ethanol become an increasingly important part of India's energy strategy. Yet the move towards E100 also raises more complicated questions. If imported oil creates one form of dependence, what new dependencies might replace it? Much of India's ethanol is currently produced from crops such as sugarcane, maize, and rice. Those crops are part of the food system, and in the case of sugarcane, often required significant amounts of water, which means the debate is no longer simply about energy. It is about priorities. How much land should be used for fuel? How much should be used for food? How should scarce water resources be allocated? These are not arguments against ethanol. They are reminders that every solution creates trade-offs of its own. The challenge for policymakers is not to eliminate dependence altogether. No country can do that. The challenge is deciding which forms of dependence are easier to manage. Supporters of ethanol argue that long-term answer lies in second-generation fuel produced from agriculture residue rather than food crops. India generates enormous quantity of crop waste every year, much of which is burned in fields. Turning that waste into fuel could reduce pollution, create rural income, and strengthen energy security without competing directly with food production. It is an attractive idea. The question is whether it can be achieved at the scale India requires. That remains uncertain. What is certain is that the debate has become more urgent after the past few months. The workers killed in the Gulf, the ceasefire in the Strait of Hormuz, and the files signed in Nagpur may appear to belong to different stories. In reality, they are connected by the same underlying question: how vulnerable should India remain to decisions made elsewhere? The economist Karl Polanyi once observed that major transformations often look like ordinary administrative decisions while they were happening. Only later does their significance become clear. Perhaps that is true here as well. Today, Gadkari's signatures look like a technical policy step. A decade from now, it may be seen as a part of a larger effort to make India's economy a little less dependent, a little more resilient, a little better prepared for the next crisis that arise from beyond its borders. Because there will be a next crisis. The question is whether India will be vulnerable to it as it was this time.